The last week of August closed with a promise that sounded like a miracle but was in fact a carefully constructed trap. And only a few days later, everything Leslie had clung to for the future was yanked from her hands like a rug pulled in an empty foyer, turning the fear of being stripped of everything into a tangible experience that seeped into the smallest details of daily life. From the moment Ted declared he would hand over his family's house to Leslie, the sequence moved along a track he controlled. Calls from real estate agents urging her to make quick decisions about the apartment tied to the family's property ecosystem, advisories to cancel deposits to avoid overlapping financial obligations, drafts with half-official headers that firmed up verbal assurances, all of it persuading Leslie that the safest, wisest choice was to step away from the project deal and pivot toward a home with history and memory and a promise that her name would be placed upon it. Leslie did not know that the instant Ted floated those 3 words give the house he had already measured procedural delays, legal gaps, and financial chain reactions so that every step she took would slide into the void he designed. A corridor where each door that seemed to open ushered her into a new hallway of doubt, dependency, and invisible debt. It was at the hinge between trust and the need for stability that Eva entered, because she had taken the initiative to seek out Ted, calling him the only adult who could keep Leslie from committing to an apartment aligned with a rival sphere, and even coaxing her mother to believe there were shorter routes, fewer risks, and a reliable shoulder to lean on, before she could grasp that the shoulder was colder and more drenched in power than any granite wall in Fairmont Crest. At first, Eva meant only to reduce conflict and scrutiny by steering away from a transaction that would sharpen a family standoff, imagining that if the path shifted to a house Ted would provide, the air would thin and everyone could stand inside a circle of safety. But the responses she received quickly exposed another face of Ted, soft warnings that read like writs, conditions threaded with finesse yet delivered in a warm voice, nods of assent paired with meetings with accountants and lawyers, whose agendas never advanced beyond the border of promise. And Eva understood that this was a stage where her father stood center, using a family heirloom as a prop to prove he could make others change course and sentiment. From that point, guilt and revulsion swelled in Eva because she recognized herself as the one who had opened the door for Leslie to step into the room Ted intended, a room lined with velvet and missing a key on the inside, and no matter how many times she pounded on the wood, the echo that came back was the chilly laughter of manipulation. The plan sharpened when Leslie canceled her deposit on the apartment, terminated talks with the broker, and redirected significant funds into polishing, appraising, and preliminary repairs on the house Ted had paraded as a family treasure. Every document Leslie saw bore the stamp of an asset management entity, yet the owner name appeared in the form of a trust rather than an individual, a small detail Ted called internal procedure and promised to convert swiftly, while Leslie, eager to believe, tucked it aside so as not to puncture the brief calm she had been chasing for months. She even drafted redesign options, budgeted interiors, and mapped the financial path so that in the end she would have not just a roof but an asset in her name, a declaration that she could turn the page without sheltering under anyone. When readiness reached the point of ripeness, a wall appeared. The trust notified her that the house fell under a preservation covenant and could not be transferred for the time being. The bank signaled that any improvement expenditures without a formal transfer would be treated as voluntary risk and carry no protection. Ted fell silent and sent a vague reassurance that everything required more time. In one short week, Leslie found herself losing more than she gained, forfeiting her old deposit when the cancellation clause did not meet the deadline, losing the apartment's price lock as the developer announced incentives had ended, and losing negotiating leverage as whispers spread that she was engaging a house entangled in trust restrictions. The sensation of being stripped of everything became not just the loss of a home or a deal but the loss of direction, the loss of self-determination, the loss of her own voice in a story where she was supposed to be the lead. While Leslie grappled with tangible losses, Eva faced the intangible part as the noble silhouette of a father she wanted to rely upon fractured under the weight of facts. She tried to confront Ted and ask for plain answers, but what she received was a smile disguised as philosophy about life's unfair balance, about how those who look for shortcuts must pay the tuition of trust, about how extracting anything from a family trust required more than goodwill. Beneath the varnish of aphorisms, Eva walked away with a sharp ache, her youthful anger colliding with a child's instinct to repair what she had broken, knowing that silence would make her a gear in the machine grinding Leslie down. Confrontation alone could not alter a terrain where Ted had raised his defenses. Backstage stories that Leslie was rash and uninformed, hints that Nicole had never supported a move and exerted silent pressure, insinuations that the family sphere would never permit Leslie to enter through any door. In the tangle, Eva learned another shard of truth, that Nicole had refused to praise Ted after he recited his efforts, and the denial humiliated him enough to convert effort into a weapon, to ferment shame into a storm, and to find a fuse in a third party. That third party was Tomas, a name close enough for Leslie and Eva to trust, distant enough for Ted to plant. What Leslie and Eva asked of Tomas sounded modest and surgical, a blend of strategic and legal help to restore negotiating posture, to pull Leslie out of the trust's paper pit by setting deadlines that forced Ted toward a concrete commitment, and to preserve an exit route back to the original project if necessary. What Ted carried to Tomas was an entirely different package, a shortcut into a fight with the family, a chance to stand as a folk champion slamming into a patrician wall, the kind of invitation that flatters anyone who lets emotion outrun reason. Ted understood that a snub from Nicole could be converted into visible power only if he could bend a mirror, and Tomas, with his history of friction and skepticism toward old structures, was the perfect candidate to throw into the gyre, both to jam the lines and to force Nicole to stare at the fallout of withholding approval. Recruiting Tomas was not merely a personal animus but an expansion strategy, turning the transfer of a house into tinder for an emblematic clash between class and legacy, where people like Leslie and Eva would be shield or pawn depending on who told the tale. Amid the performance, Kat remained the eye that watched without blinking. She visited the notary's office to extract snippets of papers Leslie had seen in haste, scanned headings, checked dates, matched seals, and found an irritation that would not go away. Every signature in the folder came as an internal e-signature with no public notarization, which meant the house had never truly been placed on the transfer table. Kat bumped into another layer, that the trust overseeing the house held a conservation clause that suspended conveyance until a fixed milestone, something Ted knew yet repeatedly minimized as simple paperwork that would be done in days. In every blurred note Kat traced Ted's silhouette, a player fluent in rules forcing others to learn them by enduring pain. She also spotted a volatile detail, that the message thread between Eva and Ted about persuading Leslie to step away from the apartment had been inadvertently exposed inside a system. And if the fragment landed in the wrong hands, the story would mutate into an accusation that Eva colluded with her father to break her mother, when the truth was that Eva had tried to cool a larger conflict. Kat knew that if the thread exploded, the first targets would not be Ted or Nicole but Eva, followed by Leslie, because the crowd always finds it easier to believe in a young person's betrayal than in an experienced manipulator's deceit. Martin stood at a different corner of the board but could not remain outside. Permits, conservation reviews, improvement valuations, and community impacts can pass across a desk he advises, and a single cautious recommendation can alter timetables for both sides. Martin approached the matter like a civil servant of conscience, validating sources, querying the archives, evaluating community ripples, discovering that the tangle was not simply a domestic spat but the use of an unbound promise to manipulate a citizen's financial choice. He refused to let anyone deploy the institution as a prop for a public tribunal, and he understood that once the issue spilled outside pure law, public narrative would price the damage. He contacted Kat to align a path for information, insisting that documents must hold their context so truth would not be milled into feed for pushing young people into the web's dark corners. While they rebuilt an order of facts, Leslie reached the harshest threshold, the first time she entertained the notion that Eva had helped lead her astray. There was no explosion and no crash, only the long quiet of a mother realizing the child who thought she was doing right had, out of inexperience, handed the handle of the knife to someone else. Leslie refused to turn the feeling into an indictment, because she knew too well how the world forces the young to choose in the dark. Yet she could not deny that without Eva's initial meeting with Ted, she might have kept a protective shield labeled doubt. The tug between forgiveness and hurt pushed Leslie to face Ted not as a petitioner but as a party with questions about why he used a family gift to test power and why he drove a woman to pay for education with her future. Even without a reply, she saw the answer under his pride. The hunger to be acknowledged by Nicole and the disappointment large enough to weaponize everything. Leslie resolved to stop waiting for another promise and asked Kat and Martin to save what could be saved, to reopen talks with the original developer despite lost incentives, to press the trust for a written declaration of non-transferability in the stated window, and to build a media perimeter to block distortions aimed at Ted. Having driven the story to the point he believed would earn him recognition, plunged into rage when Nicole refused even a nod. Shame curdled into escalation. He primed eager ears with rumors that the family sphere isolates anyone who touches its assets. He inflated his image as the lone man brave enough to release power outward, and when he needed a symbol to push the wave, he reached for Tomas. The invitation grew beyond scattered support into a promise of a central role in openly challenging the system, buoyed by resources and lighting. It was the sort of show in which, if Tomas accepted from anger or the desire to redeem someone, he would be swallowed whole before he knew it. Tomas was not easily lulled. He met Leslie, heard Eva, listened to Kat's evidence, and posed a simple question to himself about who he would fight for and to what end. He knew that by siding with Ted, the battle would become a choreographed spectacle, and by siding with Leslie and Eva, he would choose the long, quiet burden of responsibility. He said nothing publicly, but he began by refusing unnecessary cameras and by insisting that everything return to paper, obligation, and proper jurisdiction. When the secrets slid toward the light, the question of who would lose everything became more complicated than it looked at first glance. Leslie might lose money and opportunity and a measure of faith in familiar faces, yet she preserved the rarest prize, the ability to choose again with a broader field of view and better barricades. Eva might lose an image in select eyes and the right to pass through family decisions untouched, but she reclaimed the nerve to face her mistake, to enter the heart of the problem and stop a loop of control. Ted might lose the club of admirers, the potency of promise as a tool, and most of all the illusion that applause alone could stitch every ripped seam in the coat of power. The harsh physics of games like this says the first casualties are rarely their architects but the ones standing near the blast. Kat becoming a target for touching sensitive files, Martin dragged into questions about institutions despite his caution, a community split by half-told stories flaring in dry winds. Look one layer deeper and the adults who design schemes may escape the first storm, yet the young like Eva and Kat carry the residue, which is the real price of promises that never bind themselves to duty. The new week unfolded like a map of choices. Leslie signed civil motions to compel the trust to confirm non-transferable status within the stated period and to freeze any retroactive spin on the narrative, while asking the developer to reopen terms at a higher number with a strict schedule to prove seriousness, because sometimes paying a price is how control returns to the hand. Eva went to Ted not for apology or relief, but to return his share of responsibility, demanding he acknowledge publicly that the promised transfer was impossible within the window he used to calm Leslie, and demanding he strip the hooks from the show he was staging around Tomas. She accepted that blood ties do not hide the cut, and the only way to stop the bleeding is to put down the knife and tell the truth. Kat prepared a dry, unassailable report in which every date, seal, and clause sat precisely where it belonged, ready to drag any speculator back to black and white. Martin planned a minimal communications path so the guessing machine would not devour the innocent again, reminding each side that the rules choose no faction but always punish the leaper. Ted wavered between reflection and escalation and chose not to lower his voice until Nicole recognized his push, arranging meetings, seeding fresh vignettes, recruiting local voices to assemble a parallel battleground with himself cast as the force of change. What he did not calculate was that once documents stack high enough, and once the supposedly small people lock shoulders, rhetorical fog clears faster than expected. Tomas appeared at a closed meeting, set down 2 folders, one from Ted that crowned him a standard-bearer and one culled by Leslie, Kat, and Martin to follow due process, and he chose the second without fanfare or light, only because it was right. When the door shut, the war did not end, but the road became visible. Leslie had not recovered everything, but she had recovered herself. Eva had not erased every shadow, but she had blocked the shortcut that would have branded her an accomplice. Kat was not entirely safe, but she possessed a wall of facts. Martin was not beyond scrutiny, but he had traced a line that carried both law and conscience. Ted had not collapsed, but he had lost the illusion that power can be built from impossible gifts. If someone asks who will shoulder the final cost, the fairest answer is that consequence divides itself among all, with the heaviest portion allotted to the young who are seated before velvet-lined traps. The only cure is not another promise but the discipline of truth, written, signed, and owned, so that in the weeks to come, when the noise rises again, each person knows their square on the board and how to move without falling into anyone's orbit.